Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to be a couple more minutes waiting for our presenters, and then we will start. You can't hear me. Okay. Fernanda, you can hear me. Karen, can you hear me now? Right. So I think, Karen, please let me know when you're able to hear me so we can start, seeing as you are the first speaker. Thanks everybody for hanging on. We will start in a couple of minutes. Welcome, Elias, Michael, Robbie, Pian. Thanks for joining us. We will start as soon as possible. Just fixing one sound issue and we're good to go. Can you hear me or not really, Karen? Great. I'm glad that you can hear me, Elias. Karen, I think, is trying to fix her issue, and we will start as soon as it is fixed. Hey, can you hear me, Karen? Hope you can hear me now. It worked. Oh, yeah, it did. It did. I assume you're not hearing me still. hopefully. Well, as Karen fixes her mic issue, hopefully that gets sorted. I'd like to welcome you all again. Thank you so much for joining us in our second webinar on corporate capture. This event has been organized by the Corporate Accountability Working Group, but particularly the Project Advisory Group of the Corporate Capture Project. For those who don't know me, my name is Muna. I'm the coordinator of the Corporate Accountability Working Group, and thanks so much for joining again. Really appreciate it. So following our first webinar that we did in April, where we introduced what we mean by corporate capture, this webinar will be the first one to unpack one of the different manifestations of this increasing reality of corporate capture, where corporations are having undue influence on decision-making processes all over the world. So the Project Advisory Group has identified community manipulation as one of the most common manifestations of corporate capture, both in their own work, but also in the work of so many members of ESCR network. And so today we will have presentations to illustrate what we mean by community manipulation and what we understand as community manipulation through the different members of the ESCR network, as well as we'll have some analysis, hopefully, from Karen and Bobby and others who will highlight what are the different components of community manipulation as it relates to corporate capture. So we encourage you to ask questions in the chat box. Unfortunately, there's no way to do it by word, but please do feel free to interact via the chat box with the presentations, and if you have any questions, we'd really love to hear them. And please let us know if you have any other comments with regards to how we can continue doing our work on community manipulation as the Project Advisory Group and ESCR network in a way that will be beneficial to the collective. So to start us off, hopefully with her mic working, would be Karen. Karen Keenan is the director of the Canadian organization Above Ground. She's a lawyer with extensive experience working with social justice NGOs in Canada and abroad, and she provides leadership on policy and law reform work aimed at enhancing government and corporate accountability mechanisms. So I'm going to give it over to Karen, and hopefully the mic will be working.
Can you hear me? I don't think it's going to work. Oh, you can hear me. Okay, so I can't hear anybody else. Awesome. So sorry, everyone. I'm having trouble with my microphone, and I couldn't hear Mona. So apologies for being stunned when it came over to me, and for any confusion. So I didn't hear what Mona said. I can imagine that she welcomed everyone and introduced me. I'm going to share some very brief introductory comments, reminding those of you who may know and introducing those who don't know very briefly to our corporate capture project, and then introducing one of the manifestations that we're going to discuss today, community manipulation. So very briefly, we began talking as a group about corporate capture in 2014 at one of our People's Fora. And there was interest expressed by the members who were there in focusing on this area and working together on corporate capture. And so after that forum, we formed the Project Advisory Group, which has been meeting and over the phone and in person several times to advance this collective work. And we have another strategy meeting coming up shortly in November. And just very briefly, the goals that we've set for ourselves are to clearly articulate this concept of corporate capture. And very briefly, the way we've done that is to say that we understand this concept as the influence that economic actors have, undue influence over decision makers and public institutions. And of course, our entry point, our interest in this phenomenon is in particular in how it undermines human rights. And what we've also looked to do is to clearly identify the different ways that this phenomenon manifests itself. How does it concretely show itself, or is it exercised in different spaces and in different ways? And we've done that, and some of those materials are available on our website, our network website. Beyond that, we've looked to socialize this concept, help disseminate information about it within our network and also externally. And we do that in diverse ways. One, by presenting our work in different meetings of our network and our working groups. And by presenting in external fora also, such as, for example, the UN Working Groups on Business and Human Rights Annual Forum. We've presented there. We've held side meetings to help participants understand this concept and our work on it. Also, we've disseminated information via webinars like this one. And we also produced a video, a brief animation to help to explain some of the concepts that we're looking at. We've also undertaken concrete advocacy work, for example, by including content on corporate capture in the context of the negotiations about the treaty. Finally, more recently, in 2018, many of you will know in an all-network meeting in Durban, a decision was taken to develop a campaign, a network-wide campaign on corporate capture, looking in particular on women's rights to land, housing, and access to natural resources. And at that meeting and since, there's been a great deal of interest expressed in one manifestation of corporate capture in particular, and that's community manipulation, which we're going to be talking about today. So just very briefly before I turn it over to my colleagues, what is community manipulation? What do we understand as community manipulation? They're going to describe it in more detail, but briefly, we're looking at corporate strategies that undermine community decision-making about an investment that will affect the community. And we see that there are several primary ways that this plays out. One is by companies seeking to secure the support of community leaders for an investment, and this might be done by attempting to entice community leaders by offering things like jobs or money. It might also take place by intimidating community leaders into supporting a project or an investment. We also see that companies try to create divisions or conflict within the members of a community as a way of advancing an investment, creating chaos, division, confusion, pitting people against each other, and that can be an effective mechanism for advancing an investment. And we also see that often companies employ corporate social responsibility programs to gain community support. So in very broad strokes, those are some of the mechanisms that we see companies using to manipulate communities into creating space for their projects to advance. I'm going to stop there because the other speakers are going to examine some of those particular elements in more detail. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. That was a great way to start and a great summary of community manipulation and the work of the Project Advisory Group on Community Manipulation as a Manifestation of Corporate Capture. So for our first cases from Thailand on community manipulation. We will have Ananya Ramani and Evie Van Uden from Manusia Foundation. Manusia Foundation is an Asian regional non-governmental organization promoting community empowerment to advance human rights, social justice, and peace. So without further delay, I will give the floor to Ananya and Evie.
Thank you for that introduction. So, like Mona mentioned, we, as a Asian non-governmental organization, we've had an opportunity to work in different countries in Asia. But for today, we would just be presenting two cases of community manipulation specifically from Thailand. So I would present one case, and then my colleague Ebi will follow with the second case. The case I would like to talk about is that of Tepa coal-fired power plant, which is in Pattani. It is a conflict-affected area in South Thailand. And here the community that's mainly affected is the Muslim community. So they face double marginalization as a result of this project. So this case is very important because the project owner in this case is a state-owned enterprise called the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, or EGAT. Starting in 2014, when this project was first proposed, there have been several cases where they have undermined communities that were affected as a result of the project. But in no situation is the manifestation of community manipulation more obvious than during the EIA and EHIA process. So during the EIA and EHIA process, there were 3 public hearings that were proposed by EGAT. So I'm going to provide specific instances of how there was community manipulation. So the first hearing was on 2nd November 2014, and their community members, they were called to collect free rice, and they were given T-shirts in exchange for their signature and a copy of their ID cards, basically signing on to a statement saying they attended the meeting and also agreed with all the decisions reached at the meeting. There was very little explanation given on the power plant itself. There was no information given on the negative impact. And most community members who attended were not even aware of the purpose of the hearing. During a second hearing, which was in February 2015, here the meeting was held in secret. All opponents of the project, they were not even informed of the meeting. And the community members from Pattani, they were not consulted at all. And what is very important is the fact that Pattani is only about 8 kilometers from the power plant itself. And finally, during the third hearing, things got worse because the opponents from the project, they were blocked from participating altogether, claiming they would instigate unrest under an act in Thailand called the Disaster Prevention and Mitigation Act. There was barbed wire placed around the meeting venue with over 1,500 soldiers and police surrounding the whole premises. And additionally, there were about 500 defense volunteers who were present inside the premises, so they couldn't even get close to the meeting venue at all. So this was how there was complete community manipulation during the public hearings. But the good thing about it is the communities itself are very active. They've tried to voice their disapproval of this. So how this has been done, just to give a little insight into that, the first thing was there was issuing of public statements, of course, calling for more transparency in these public hearings. And they also voiced their disapproval of the government committee that approved the EHIA report that came out of these 3 public hearings. Additionally, there are several organizations, including ours, that have taken steps to help this community. So the first thing that we did was there was community-led research that's being conducted in the area. Here, the International Accountability Project and Manusia Foundation together, we trained the Tepa community members to build credible evidence and document rights violations in these cases using the community tool developed by the International Accountability Project, in fact. And the final thing that we did was Manushya Foundation has also provided sub-grants to community members in the Tepa region to conduct their own community mapping. So it would just to map the effects on cultural and natural resources, how they would be affected by the power plant. And this is basically to guarantee that households that are otherwise excluded or have been excluded by the EIA and EHIA process, that they would be effectively taken into consideration in the overall strategic environmental assessment. So this is just a basic insight into this first case, and I'll now hand over the floor to my colleague Evie to give more explanation into another case from Sea Island. Evie?
So, good evening. I would like to introduce to you, as Ananya said, the case of Sea Island, which is located in Phuket province in southern Thailand, which you might know for its tourism. So it's a lot of businesses have established in the area. On Sea Island there's a high number of indigenous people who lives there on their ancestral lands. And even though Thailand has voted in favor of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, the indigenous people are not recognized under the Thai constitution. That we can also see in this case that the indigenous people on Sea Island, I'm talking about the Udak Lawoi community members, who do not have land titles, even though they have lived on these lands for generations. In this case, there has been a lack of free, prior, and informed consent, and this was not obtained in this case, and that together with community manipulation, different tactics have been used to force the indigenous people of their ancestral lands, which has then been given to individuals who have sold it to investors, violating the fundamental human rights of the communities. So I would like to talk about the community manipulation that has happened in this case. So where it happened and how did it happen? So first of all, community manipulations have happened in the issuance of land titles. So the land where the indigenous people reside on has been given to an individual, and this was the issuance of that land title was based on signatures that the community has provided in agreements to install electricity. So villagers just signed for electricity to be installed in their homes, and later on these signatures have been misused. Other tactics that were used to force the community of their lands were they were asked to sign a contract that would allow them to live temporarily on their land, and the government as well tried to implement a rental agreement that they would hand over the land that they actually owned. Then the land where they lived had been sold to investors in 2012, and then the people who had bought the land, they have sued the Udak Lawoi, the indigenous people, and they had requested for land eviction and for them to pay compensation. So during the legal proceedings, community manipulation has happened as well. First of all, the information was restricted between the village head and the lawyer, so there was no effective participation of the community members. Their concerns and their input was not heard and not listened to. Then the lawyer who was involved in the case, actually this lawyer was proposed by a former parliamentarian linked to the government, and he assured the community that they would win the case, and he asked for very high legal fees. And that time when he assured that the community would win the case, especially the indigenous women, they expressed their doubts about such an assurance. And as the women expressed their doubts, they were just excluded from the legal proceedings. They were not provided any information anymore. They were excluded from the evidence gathering, from the surveys. They were excluded from the whole process. And as well, in the legal proceedings, manipulation happened in the witness selection in the appeal court. So the villagers had proposed a witness, one of the defendants who had been involved in the case, who documented the history of the islands, of the land ownership, as well as of the case of the villagers. However, then the witness turned hostile, and then they had lost in the appeal court, which ruled in favor of the investors. Lastly, financial manipulation has occurred in this case. Without any credible evidence, 150 Thai baht had been collected from the villagers, and they were told that in case they would not pay their share of this amount, they would have to move out from the.
Ananya, I think we lost you. I will. Yes, we lost you. I'll redirect to you now. Hopefully it can connect again. Sorry about that. Sorry, Evie, to cut you off in the middle.
Human Rights Commission.
Ananya, I think we lost you.
Okay. Can you hear us? Hello? I'm not sure. Yeah,
So Evie will just be continuing with the case. Sorry.
Yes, so how have these issues been addressed? So various institutions have done investigation into this case. First of all, in 2008, the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand, they recommended the concerned government agencies to investigate the case and repeal land titles that have been issued in the area of residence of the indigenous people. However, unfortunately, so far there is no information about any follow-up measures on this recommendation. Secondly, in 2011, the Public Sector Anti-Corruption Commission of Thailand also said to further investigate the case, and they informed relevant agencies to revoke any land titles until investigation would take place. But so far, no land titles have been revoked. Then in 2019, this year, in August, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the indigenous people. However, so far they are still awaiting effective resolution. Then lastly, what future steps are required to address these issues? So together with the Indigenous Women Network of Thailand, we have held a community-led and participatory research report, which has been launched this week. And the community has here documented their story based on credible evidence that they have gathered. And they have also provided recommendations that they would like to see implemented. So first of all, they would like to seek legal support from governmental authorities and non-governmental organizations for the withdrawal of the current false land titles. They would like to ensure the conduct of effective investigation by competent government authorities. And there is a need to organize a dialogue with relevant provincial and national authorities for issuance of a community land title, which would protect the community from being evicted again in the future. So from Manusia Foundation, we will be undertaking steps to ensure that these recommendations will be addressed. So we'll be trying to meet with the Ministry of Justice in the next month, and we'll try to ensure that all their recommendations will be followed accordingly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mona. We would like.
Thank you so much, Ananya and Evie. Hopefully we'll have some questions for you towards the end of the webinar, but that was really comprehensive and very detailed examples of community manipulation in Thailand. Thanks so much for that. I will go to the next speaker, who's José Jiménez from Comité Ambiental Defensa de la Vida. And José is part of Comité Ambiental, which is a social movement that has been utilizing corporate capture framework in their work and their advocacy over the past couple of years. And José will discuss a case of community manipulation in Colombia, but also will reflect on corporate capture in the region of Latin America. So, Jose, I will go to you now.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Wonderful. May you all have a great day. And I want to thank you for today's scenario, for today's webinar, for us to join in order to address this highly complicated issue, for us to have a better knowledge on how these projects have upscaled and have placed communities in such a situation, placing them in vulnerabilities of their rights. Especially when we talk about community manipulation from corporate capture, we're making reference to that instrumentality in decision-making and communities' participation together with investment projects. So we may highlight that some of these actions of community manipulation are social and leader organizations having short budgets, intimidation, job offers, and all of those actions whose main goal is generating a favorable environment for companies to the short term. Companies are seeking for, or corporations are seeking for, acceptance or this social licensing in territories. All of these financing projects are presented as benefits to a project, starting from social responsibility incoming from power corporations, specifically in Colombia and in Latin America. I'd like to make reference to 4 specific patterns that we have identified from the Comité Ambiental en Defensa de la Vida, and these are on corporate capture. First is an ideological factor. Companies create fundamental ideas trying to delve into community thinking. They do this from the anthropocentric vision of the territory, meaning that men and women can make use of all of their environment, since according to this vision, man is at the top of this food pyramid and all that's underneath may be eaten, exploited, used, extracted by men, according to this scientific and technological reasoning. So when people are told this ideological factor, they believe that they may extract all of the underground minerals and subsoil elements without bearing in mind that they are having an impact in communities, without bearing in mind that they are affecting the environment and nature, which is harming the territory overall. So this is a political feature that's used by corporations in order to reach the territory. Whenever people think that there are no other production ways, they think that the project is right there because they need it to exist in order to have social development in their communities. Now here comes the second factor, which is the cultural factor. Corporations, through community manipulation, intend to control life ways or ways of living, and they intend to represent traditional elements in community, thinking that it is a single social development vision. Throughout this single vision, we see that it is a unique thinking. It's based on mining extraction. This activity invalidates community ways of living, alternative ways of living, and these aren't visible to communities. They intend to show that there's only one way of living. And when they reach territories, when these type of cultural visions reach territories, they try to develop empathy with communities by telling them that they are part of the territory. Right there, companies or corporations give names to their projects that are based on mountains or rivers. These are identity elements from the community that they are using so that they can see the project as if it were their own, which is what happened in La Tolima department with La Colosa mining project. They made use of a hill that's near the project's location. So this factor happens not only here in Colombia, but in the whole Latin American continent. We see how companies, on the other hand, not only are they coining territorial names for their projects, but they also intend to create recycling projects. They create this citizen, environmentally responsible culture, and once again, it goes into community manipulation. Communities think that these are corporations that have respect for nature, that they are promoting sustainable dynamics in others. So these are the two factors, and the third one that we've identified is an economic factor. Right here is where mining power projects, whenever they reach a territory in Latin America, that's where they try to create productive project financing. They share this idea throughout community and public opinion by saying that agriculture may be sustainable, especially if there are mining and power projects nearby. It could be hydrocarbon extraction, it could be fracking, it could be any dynamics based on this model. So when they start financing this type of productive projects, they are also playing with people's needs. For instance, in Colombia, land is complicated. It is one of the countries that has the highest rates of inequality in land tenure. Now, the Colombian land is not producing as much as it should. Colombia has 114 hectares, out of which 50 are used for agriculture. Now, only 5 million of these hectares are used for agricultural production. So therefore there is inequality and food disadvantage. All of these are feasible for oil palm, and what it allows is that when companies reach territories and they say we will be financing productive projects, since people have no means to produce for them to have a good income, companies bring along their money, they sponsor projects, and in this way they gain communities since they are seen as benefactors. However, what's happening under those scenarios is that companies are doing what states should be doing. They are impersonating statal doings. Now, companies' ways of operating in community manipulation is they start lobbying on projects' benefits. These are NGOs that seek to get this projects. They are related to indigenous communities, and even political parties and the Congress, among other members, in order to get media interest, community interest. They try to clean up the corporation's image before territories. And this type of mining power projects, on the other hand, have a feature for community manipulation, and that is they finance infrastructure projects. When companies reach territories, communities are gathered, agricultural projects are presented, livestock projects are presented, let's say financing projects are presented as community entrepreneurship, but they also start governance works. For instance, schools get painted, or Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi is given to communities. They purchase materials for hospitals, schools, They even start concrete paving ways, and as we know, they are just playing with people's needs so that they can create a favorable scenario for themselves. Since, as I was saying, they impersonate state, and state is therefore left aside, leaving the whole community control to corporations. In this case, communities are submerged in an empowering scenario, and corporations are, in this case, the only ones that are able to lift community and persons from this empowering system. But whenever any of these strategies works, then corporations open job offers. They start hiring people with no former requirement regarding these experts they need to have. We should have engineers, sociologists, and others, but they start hiring community members for park doings. They can be painting parks or doing exercise. What they want is to encroach community with this need. Colombia is one of the countries that has the highest lack of jobs. And the city where I live in, we are the third city with the highest unemployment rate. And Cajamarca municipality, for instance, is one of the ones that faces this situation the most. And these corporations wanted to benefit from the lack of employment in those territories. They are seeking for acceptance in this community. And well, the fourth element is media. Right here, in order to achieve this community manipulation, corporations start hiring media. They pay radio stations, which represents benefits for the project. They start paying to the newspapers, magazines, and they are publishing the project's benefits from their own logic. They even pay for TV shows. Just a few years ago, Caracol TV, which is the largest broadcasting TV show in the country, they were saying how this company was a victim since they were accused of the assassination of Cesar Garcia, who passed away in unknown conditions. So the company then paid this media so that they could create a documentary which was broadcasted in an active hour, where they said that the company was not linked to the situation, that they were an environmentally, socially responsible company, and that they were going to benefit the country. So they were looking for acceptance through media. An additional factor within this media vision is public acceptance. They are showing a good image. They are sharing brochures, house by house. And it's just like as NGOs do, they knock on each door in order to share the project's benefits. And last but not least is violence. Violence is the main factor when the rest are not working out. Companies try to manipulate communities through threats, done to those opposing projects. This places community in a fearful scenario, and they stop believing, they stop working as a community, and as a result, corporations have a free way to operate. So it is about creating an image within community as if people that are opposing the project are terrorists or against it. And I think that what happens at a Latin American level, as we've seen in other scenarios, is precisely this violence. That's what we've achieved from a collective analysis from Comité Ambiental en Defensa de la Vida. That is what we believe corporate capture is from community manipulation. We believe that strategies are monumental for us to keep on finding these scenarios, discussing them, and for us to implement community evidence to make this corporate capture evident. We need to keep on working with communities, peoples in our territories, and we should create an observatory or corporations mapping in order to identify those that are affected from these pillars of corporate capture. Thus, we will be able to have a more firm campaign, just as we are doing, to discuss corporate capture impacts. As Karen was saying, we are seeing that corporate capture undermines human rights, it violates human rights, and that is precisely what we need to mitigate. That is my main comment. Thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully I can keep on adding to these discussions. Thank you. Gracias, José, por esta presentación.
And the example of community manipulation in Colombia, it seems that there's a lot of similarities across regions in terms of how community manipulation takes place at the hands of corporations. And this really puts into perspective a lot of the different elements of community manipulation. So for our last speaker, I will go to Fernanda Hoppenheim from Poder, who is based in Mexico, working and has been one of the founding members of the Corporate Capture Project. And she'll be sharing with us some remarks of an example of community manipulation in Mexico, but also some concluding remarks, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes to answer any questions afterwards. So please feel free to write in the comment in the chat box if you have any questions that you would like to share with us. On to you, Fernanda.
Hola, buenos días y buenas tardes para los que estén.
Good evening if you're in the other side of the ocean. Well, I have conclusion remarks.
Hablando algunas ideas de los ejemplos de los.
Some examples that we work with in Mexico. There are different cases in the country of communities that are facing large companies, specifically mining companies or corporations. And I'd like to share two very quick examples of community manipulation done by these corporations. The first case is a mining company. They intend to open an open sky mine in Puebla in the northern Sierra. And right there what we've noticed is that from public consultation and from community consultation conducted 3 months or 4 months ago, there was a major interference process that corporation tried to have an impact. And there are two concrete examples of community manipulation. On the one hand, before this consultation took place, as my Colombian peer mentioned, Jose, this corporation reached municipal authorities, which is very common in Mexico, even if at a federal level it is out of goodwill in order to improve regulations, in this case the mining regulation and the environmental regulation. Well, at a municipal level, corporate capture is very present. So this corporation reached an agreement with the municipal government regarding where this consultation would take place, and they decided to provide money for chairs and sound and paint the walls. So since the beginning, they had a major role in organizing this public consultation. Yes, organization was in the hands of authorities. It was their obligations, and authorities said, we accept, quote unquote, the collaboration of this company because they are the ones that have budget, and we can have a pretty auditorium. We are able to use microphones and sound. But before the public consultation took place, which was a very large session with 1,500 individuals, there was already an inadequate impact and interference, which was inadequate. We complained to authorities, and the very same day, this is the second manifestation of this community manipulation, this corporation brought 7 buses of mining employees working from other states, Veracruz and other parts of Puebla. They brought them to the public consultation, and these people have no decision making in this project. They are working in that project. Nonetheless, 7 buses were brought there. Perhaps they included 350 to 500 to 400 people. They were wearing shirts and caps with the company's name, which is also ill will. And as a clear example, this company carried out poor practices, and they always intended to manipulate communities. But I wanted to share these 2 very concrete and practical examples. Sometimes corporate capture in our minds seems to be very sophisticated, and when we talk about community manipulation, it's sometimes very evident as basic, such as bringing people in buses wearing their mining shirts. And in Sonora, in the northern part of Mexico, people affected by the worst mining spill provoked by Grupo México. Grupo México is the largest mining company in the country. They have transnational operations. So this is a Latin American capital company, and its impact. We've seen that there's manipulation, signatures, assembly documents, decisions, community decisions. These are all manipulated, and we see it in the region as well. Whenever community assemblies take place, they are called ejidos. These are community-based organizations of rural entities or peasants. They may or may not be indigenous, but ejidos basically have their own authorities in place. And we see a very important interference of companies in order to manipulate assembly decision making. And this is only adding up to my colleagues' examples. As you see, large companies' practices happen very similarly worldwide. This community manipulation phenomenon, we can see it shares the same patterns in Latin America, but also in South Asia or Africa or in the Pacific region. Now, from previous interventions, only for concluding remarks, I'd like to reflect upon some comments made. For instance, our Thailand colleagues said that one of the cases they shared was not on behalf of a transnational, but on behalf of a state corporation. So as activists and human rights defenders, accompanying or sometimes being parts of those communities, we also need to have a deep look into what is happening with companies that have state control. There are United Nations regulations and others that say that when state is acting with economic agent, their responsibility in avoiding damage is even larger. So responsibility right here is not happening, and I think that we should delve deeper into what is happening with state-owned companies. And we also heard cultural capture, ideological capture or culture, the storytelling, and this is another manifestation of corporate capture, that is storytelling capture or cultural capture. we may see how all of these manifestations are intertwined. When there is community manipulation, as Jose was saying, well, we also see a manipulation on the community social development and their vision, or what is their way of living that is presented to them as a single alternative. We see that people are played based on their lack of jobs, and there is a short-term vision that does not allow populations to see to the long term, which will have impacts to the environment, the right of water, and life. And there's also the economic factor, where we see information manipulated at a community level based on the so-called or alleged benefits that a mine or another project will bring to communities. Or there's this alleged possibility of combining a local agriculture with mining activity or with an infrastructure project. For instance, a hotel. Bear in mind that tourism also has impacts, and there is community displacement. There are environmental impacts also in extensive agricultural businesses. And now there is a lack of effective participation. It's rather simulation, as I said, in Mexico, where the company was present and interfering since the onset of that consultation, or public consultations take place, but they are not including authorities. In this case, there is authority manipulation as well, and this is performed by the corporation. And governance too. Communities should be included. Companies should not participate where they are not major elements. And this confrontation between people working on a mining project, let's say these job source brought by a large-scale project, and communities that will be affected. There are these two parts. Companies exploit workers. They don't provide them benefits in accordance to the law. However, both groups are manipulating the community and workers so that there is confrontation between them. And instead of them creating an alliance, they will be opposing their perspectives. This is a very clear community manipulation factor. And lastly, all of the business social responsibility processes. We see that there are projects such as building schools, painting auditoriums, or a basketball court. We see them doing those activities as if it were to prevent their large-scale projects and consequences. Mona, these are my concluding remarks, and we can now move on into the Q&A if you agree with me. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Fernanda.
This is a great place to stop and go back to the presenters with questions. Please feel free to write any questions that you have in mind in the chat box, and we can read them out and have the presenters answer. If I may start with one question on the general aspect of how can we as communities overcome community manipulation, and if we can spend maybe the last half an hour of this webinar talking about ways that we could possibly overcome community manipulation or any obstacles that we specifically face in cases of community manipulation. That would be quite important to talk about. Perhaps maybe the first question to Karen with regards to policy and legislative reforms, and whether you see that there are obstacles in terms of policy and legislative reform that exist so that we can overcome community manipulation. So I will give you the floor now.
Thanks, Mona. And this time I can hear you, so thank you. So I just want to explain a little bit that I gave a very brief overview of our project and the areas of our work. One area that I didn't mention is that we have been trying to take a look at not just what corporate capture is and how it manifests itself, how communities are confronted with this phenomenon, but also what are things that we can do? What are steps that can be taken to prevent corporate capture or to mitigate it? And one area that my organization in particular has been looking at in the context of this project is policy and legal reform to create mechanisms, a governance structure for corporations that could limit or at the very least make more transparent the different forms of manipulation and co-optation that are happening so that we can minimize that influence and or at least make it more visible so that people understand what's happening and can engage in those processes with a clear understanding of what's going on. And we've in particular taken a look at this with respect to some of the other forms of corporate capture, the other manifestations that we have been examining. For example, interference in the legislative process, policymaking and legislative process, when corporations have undue influence over governance, government policymaking, and what kinds of mechanisms can be put in place to balance the influence of different actors in the work of our representatives. And we have done less work on what kind of policy or legal mechanisms could be put into place to control community manipulation. So that's an area that I think that we'd like to work on collectively, and we'd like to engage members in if they have experience or ideas in that area to begin to understand better what kind of mechanisms can be put into place. But I would just say very briefly, because again, we haven't done any sort of systematization of that work, is that we do see that there is a lack of protective mechanisms, or in some jurisdictions where mechanisms might exist to solicit community input in decision-making that affects them and to protect them from this kind of undue influence in their decision-making processes, that many times those mechanisms are inadequate or they're not effectively enforced. One of the main focal points for this kind of discussion has been the right of communities to offer or withhold their consent to projects. And we see different legislative policy mechanisms to gauge or solicit communities' perspectives on that question, so to consult communities or to seek their consent. And we know, for example, in my country, in Canada, there are legislative provisions about that, but in other countries too, in countries like Peru, there's legislation on the books. But these mechanisms often we find are ineffectual in ensuring that community perspectives are respected and that community leaders are not co-opted in the different ways that we've heard about today. So that's a very brief answer, but I think what I want to emphasize is that I think there's some interesting work for us to do there to better understand how that happens and to develop a position on what more effective proposals would be for ensuring that local decision-making is respected when communities step forward and articulate their perspective on a particular investment. Thanks, Mona.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a great response from you on policy and legislative reform with regards to trying to combat community manipulation. I have a few questions for Manusha Foundation. One from Fernanda with regards to the involvement of the state-owned company in one of the cases that you had mentioned. If you could speak more to that and whether you think there is a better opportunity for accountability for that particular company because it is a state-owned company. And then we have another question from Tien from IIP Thailand asking whether you see community-led research as an approach to bring the TEPA community together for the same ideal vision and action. And just to follow up on that, I think there's, you've mentioned the community documentation tool, and would be great to hear from you whether that specific tool has been useful and helpful for the communities thus far, and any sort of reactions to that. I'm taking it over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I'll first just answer Fernando's question. That's actually, it's a very good question. It's been really useful to us that the state-owned enterprise has been involved because it's easier to then question their responsibility in this whole aspect, because the other angle that gets added to it is not just the fact, not just the fact that there is community manipulation, but also the fact that when it comes to corporate capture, the government is involved at all three steps. So besides being involved in drafting of the EIA and EHIA report, they do have influence over the approval of the report itself. And in some cases, what they've also managed to do is they've used administrative orders to do away with an EIA and EHIA process altogether, which was also specifically seen in this case. I didn't mention it because we were dealing more with manifestations of community manipulation, but it wasn't just the community manipulation factor. There were several reasons that made it easier to hold the state-owned enterprise accountable in this case. So actually, it has been an advantage for us. Answering Tien's question, thank you so much, Tien. Both her and her colleague Tom, the work of the International Accountability Project has been extremely useful to us. So just to provide a basic background, if there are some people out there who don't know about IAP's tool, so the tool IAP has developed gives a step-by-step guidance on how communities can lead their own research, so that they can themselves determine what should be their priorities when it comes to development projects, and what should be their development priorities in their community. And it also gives a lot of practical tools and tips and activities that can be used by communities. But also what was very useful in these trainings was, besides giving all these examples, the community members had the opportunity to sit down themselves and sort of map out what their steps would be, see what risks they could face, and come up with these mitigation plans. So it was a very hands-on process with everything thought through very well. And of course, from this leading on to the community mapping itself, that proved to be slightly more technical for the community members, because here we looked at more technical tools and how geographical information systems can be used. So that required a little more expertise, and it proved a little challenging for the community members who were involved in data collection through those methods. But they did have an advantage of learning to use a new tool, and it's proved pretty, it's been very helpful for them. That part has also been really, really helpful for them. And it's something they're still involved in, not just when it comes to the TEPA project, but other projects in the region that would affect them as well.
Thank you so much, Ananya. That was great. Thank you very much. I have a question for Jose as well. In your presentation, you were talking about violence, and that violence is what companies use most to manipulate community members and to silence them. And so my question is, what do you think are some of the ways that and the strategies that community members can push back on to overcome violence from corporate actors? I will bring it over to you, Jose, now.
Bueno, justamente
from that violent manipulation from mining companies here in La Colosa, we noticed stigmatization in public hearings. Both parties were summoned in order to discuss La Colosa project development, and right there in that hearing we were called guerrilla people, researchers. We were called environmental jihadists, terrorists, media terrorists. They created this stigma around environmental issues so that whenever we talked about these impacts, environmental impacts, they wanted to undermine it. Since communities would then think that these messages were shared by a terrorist group. So in order to combat that type of image, we first try to mention what is corporate capture, defining it along with its components and what are its characteristics. Each time that a company is operating in the territory, well, for people to notice what that is and means. And we noticed how this company would go and paint schools, and we documented how they provided hospitals with materials. And once we documented all of those activities, we would share that and visualize it through pedagogical meetings. At those meetings, we established discussions with different municipalities, Cajamarca and others as part of Lima department, communities that would be impacted by this project. Throughout these meetings, we were able to say that life was what it was at stake. We shared that this company was threatening other organizational members and that we would need to hide and complain about this type of doings on behalf of the company. Our goal was to create an unanimous reject to this mining project, and that's what we did with our building projects. Now, or rather academic projects, we now have online courses where 12,000 people can join, and we try to create a human rights group. Right there we constantly discuss what corporate capture is, and what we're doing with the legally binding instrument at an international level is we are seeking for worldwide social and environmental justice. These people are now messages of what corporate capture is, and they are working in their territories about this type of factors that may stem from these companies. And it's not only the mining and power industry, there are also different financial entities that are having corporate capture, and they are manipulating communities to benefit. We are now working in the creation of a documentary where we will be identifying these 4 components I previously mentioned: the ideological, media, culture, and the 4th element of what corporate capture is in community manipulation. And we will spread it in social media, in our fora, and each person that takes the course that we offer, in order to graduate, they need to open a meeting for 20 people that are not part of that course so that they can join and they can present a talk. Right at that lecture, we present these project impacts and how these type of projects intend to manipulate communities. What it does is therefore creating a framework vision on not allowing manipulation from corporations to happen. So this has been an intensive campaign on corporate capture in our territory. I don't know if that answers the question. Sí, José.
Thank you so much, Jose, for that additional information. I think it's important to keep hearing about cases of community manipulations that are happening across regions, so as to become more aware of the similarities of the strategies that corporations use in different parts of the world. So not just in Colombia, but also in different parts. We had today with us an example from Thailand, an example from Mexico, and there are many other examples of community manipulation. In fact, this is one of the most common manifestations of corporate capture, as I had previously mentioned, and we see it happening in many similar ways throughout the different cases that we are hearing from our members. For example, in Liberia and Sierra Leone and in India as well. So we keep seeing that manifestation of corporate capture, and it would be really helpful following this webinar and after unpacking some of the components of community manipulation together, if members who are participating or who are listening to this webinar after, because hopefully there will be a recording. We have Radiatu with us for a question. Sorry, so yeah, we will have a recording, and it will be useful to hear from you as well if you have any cases of community manipulation happening within your regions, and whether you have some experience in terms of how those cases can be overcome, or how these cases have manifested and what are the different components to it. And that will be really useful for the research that the Project Advisory Group on corporate capture is working on, but also for the development of different tools that might be useful to communities to overcome community manipulation. So I'm going to read what Radiatu's question is on. Hello from Liberia, and she's thanking Jose for the presentation, saying that there are 6 factors of community manipulation that Comité Ambiental has come out with, and she's asking if your organization has identified any strategy that communities can use to minimize these factors of community manipulation. And I think that's a really important question, and it's a question that can also go to Fernanda and to Ananya and Evie for any final remarks on examples of strategies that are identified to minimize community manipulation and the impacts of community manipulation by corporations. So I'll go to you, Jose, first, and then to Fernanda and Ananya for any final remarks.
Thank you for the questions asked. Precisely, we were just discussing that one of the strategies that we have it in 3 components. We first characterize, document, and visualize. So within characterizing what that is, we need to bear in mind an important axis, which is community building. When corporations reach territories, they are playing with the lack of information. They are benefiting from the lack of technological and scientific knowledge, even global knowledge on what's currently happening among communities. So what we're doing is through these free courses, we are providing knowledge for communities in order to defend their land. Whenever they have critical analysis on what is happening in Colombia regarding the mining power industry, then it is more difficult for corporations to reach that territory. 10 years ago in Cajamarca, when the company just started doing and holding community meetings, they wanted to present agricultural projects to the community, and what Rainso did back then was share with Robert Moran, who was one of the most important engineers working in La Chanti, and he then became an international activist denouncing these companies' impacts in Congo, in Tanzania, and in other places where the project was working in. The aim was sharing the impacts that this type of projects generated. So we created a presentation that we would share to communities. So if the corporation reached there, we also came there, and they had a hard time in fooling communities or in co-opting them. And we also did social mobilization. We were in red lights. We discussed it, and we talked to people in the vehicles or in buses. We shared what we were working on, and they were willing to listen, since what we were sharing was a fraction of 1 gram of gold by a ton of rock. In Bagué, most food is cropped right there, so when you share all of this information with people, you raise awareness, and that prevents the corporation from having a deeper impact in communities. Because of what we did, citizens were not as polarized in the Canamá municipality, because that's what they try to do. They want to polarize and split communities. But by sharing arguments with people, by sharing their traditional knowledge on territories, it was difficult, or more difficult, for corporations to manipulate communities. That's when they decided to move into threats. But of course, we also had self-protecting mechanisms. In this case, corporations had a hard time. We tried to be very visible. We had a framework. It was a very solid communitary work, door by door. We did a carnival demonstration that is hundreds of people in the streets demanding for justice, and through those scenarios we were able to visibilize corporate capture and this company and how it was trying to have an impact in communities and enroach them. Nowadays, this company has a very strong influence in institutions in the country, but this is linked to other components within corporate capture, meaning the judicial system interference and diplomacy or political lobbying done by companies. So these are some of these strategies. So creating courses, building courses. We did it with La Tolima University. This is the public university in the region. And thanks to the students' pressure, the university certified this type of courses, and community has a better acceptance for these since they are working in defending territories. In doing so, this company has not been able to permeate citizenship. We have visibilized this struggle. We mobilize people. We are actively informing on the impacts. We are complaining on media. Media does not love us, but we still try to share the impact that this project entails. And national-wise, from Comité Ambiental, we create a national scenario. We gather evidence on corporate capture across the country, showing the impact that it has in communities. So because of these doings, these companies have not had an easy time in reaching these territories. That's my comment so far. I hope to have been clear. Muchas gracias, José. Fue
very important response that I think summed up what many of us know, that communities coming together and having accurate information of what companies are doing can be very powerful and have very powerful impact. I will go for the concluding remarks, bearing in mind that we only have 2 minutes left. So I'll go to Fernanda for any last minute remarks, and then to Ananya.
Gracias, Mona. Estoy de acuerdo.
Agree with all of Jose's comments regarding having strategies for each region in place, but it has to do with struggle building and information at a community level. Only at two matters that we've used as an NGO that are accompanying this type of procedures, and that is by documenting and exposing this corporate capture and community manipulation practices, we can do so. However, the way in which we do so has to do with two specific processes. On the one hand, sometimes we are litigators, we are using this information and we say it can be at a trial, it could be at an administrative process with an authority, and we say that that's undue interference. For instance, in the Public Consultations Assembly that was held, we took documentation to to authorities. Community members took pictures of the auditorium being painted, of the speakers, and all of which was provided. And this was documented information taken to authorities, and we said if this happened, this consultation needs not to happen, since there has been an agreement on what needs to happen. They decided to postpone the date, so by making use of civil and administrative mechanisms to complain about the situations, we may progress, and also trying to limit this large framework that companies have, and also media exposure. There, certain media may be allies in order to expose these companies, and we know that corporations care about their reputation, since that allows them to have business, so that could be an interesting strategy. And finally, and making reference to the fact that it's important for us to discuss and comment in further discussions the difficulty behind it. Manipulation creates rupture in communities, and we need to bear it in mind. We have colleagues in Puebla's Northern Sierra, and they are in disputes with their neighbors. Sometimes they are having problems with their family, and there's this rupture in the social fabric. It's very harmful for people in the communities, and we need to include that in our conversation. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Fernanda.
To conclude with that very important point that you raised, Fernanda, and thanks again, everybody, for your really rich presentations, and for those who are able to join us as well. Thank you very much. Hopefully this will be downloaded and available for viewing online in the coming days, and we look forward to following up with you. Thank you again. Goodbye.